Heather Roy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak to this first reading of the Land Transport, Road Safety and Other Matters Amendment Bill. Act, Mr Speaker, will be supporting this bill to select committee, although we have a number of specific concerns that we'd like to see raised there with some provisions of this bill. As the Minister has identified, New Zealand does have a serious problem with road safety. When we compare our statistics, not just confining ourselves to young people, but across the board, when we compare our statistics to those of other countries, we're not doing well. And I've often been heard saying that there is no one silver bullet, but three things that we should be doing are what I call the 3 E's. Enforcement of the current laws, we should be taking those very seriously and doing a better job there. Education, particularly of our young people, but not exclusively when driving, and engineering. Certainly the overseas experience, that in Europe particularly, is that when you have well-engineered roads, the road toll does drop significantly. But here in New Zealand, Mr Speaker, too many Kiwis, and particularly many of our young people, are taking a somewhat reckless attitude to driving. And this is all too evident in the statistics when we look at them, which show that we far outstrip our nearest neighbour, particularly Australia, in annual road toll fatality rates. ACT is pleased that this bill does identify a number of the core factors in these fatality statistics. The bill attempts to crack down on those who have, and not just usually once or twice, but time and again, shown themselves to be irresponsible behind the wheel, allowing the courts to impose an interlock system on those who have been repeatedly caught driving under the influence of alcohol. The bill also doubles the maximum period of imprisonment from 5 years to 10 years for those found guilty of causing death while under the influence of drugs or alcohol or driving recklessly, and certainly we're in favour of that move. Such measures are to be applauded. In fact, they're long overdue, and they will target those who have shown scant regard for the safety of themselves and more particularly to others when driving. But the ACT Party does have some concerns, as I've already said, with parts of this bill. The concentration, of course, has largely been around the minimum driving age. We're not convinced that the benefits of increasing the minimum driving age from 15 to 16 outweigh the negatives, and I think that there are a large number of factors that need to be thought of when we consider this, and we welcome the opportunity to discuss these at Select Committee. One thing that I've always been personally quite swayed by is the experience of the insurance industry. They, of course, need to look very carefully at what the patterns of behaviour are so that they can put in place the premiums that they charge. And I remember reading quite some time ago, and need to dig this evidence out again, that in fact the danger period isn't solely dependent on age, and in particular focusing on youth, but in fact the danger period is when a young person has been driving for around 100 hours. And so they drive quite carefully to start with, drive with a little more caution than they perhaps do once they become more confident drivers, and that's when the accident rates start to spike. And it doesn't seem, Mr Speaker, that the starting age actually impacts very much on that pattern of behaviour. It is in fact the 100 hours beyond which the starting point for that driver has been that is the danger or the higher risk period. So those things do need to be looked at in detail at the Select Committee, and I'm hoping to be able to sit in on some of those discussions. For many people, particularly those in our rural communities, cars are the only means of transport available. In rural areas, there simply is no public transport available to them often, no public transport system, no buses, no trains, and most often no taxis either. Now, I grew up in a very small rural community in East Otago, where everybody started driving usually the day they hit 15, if not before. Certainly those kids who grew up on farms were driving well before that. And I have to say that my experience was that those who started driving before the age of 15 but on private property usually turned out to be very good and safe drivers. Rural communities do, of course, have the difficulty with roads that aren't up to scratch always, and there are a large number of factors that we do need to take into consideration, but we can't ignore the fact that young people, their lives are impacted on if the minimum driving age rises to 16. Depriving young people of the ability to drive is in many cases depriving them of employment opportunities, of sporting opportunities, social and educational opportunities, and that consideration mustn't be left out of the mix when we consider what we're going to do with this piece of legislation. Now, while there can be no doubt that young people are overrepresented in accident statistics, whether or not simply pushing their right to drive back by 1 year will solve the problem is questionable. Certainly if I come back to my 100-hour rule, the answer to that would be no. It means we just delay the same patterns by a further year. And so all of those things, as I say, do need to be investigated carefully at the Select Committee. It's an approach which will disadvantage, and I'm talking about raising the minimum driving age to 16, it's an approach that will disadvantage thousands of young Kiwis through no fault of their own. And I'll go back again to what is most effective when we look at how we tackle our shocking statistics on the road. The 3 E's, I think, are very important. Enforcement of the laws that we already have. In many cases, we race to put laws in place when there are already very good laws that exist but which are not being enforced adequately. And so rather than rush to put more on the statute books, we need to look at what we have and make sure that enforcement opportunities are there and are being routinely taken care of. Education is also hugely important. It's one thing that's easy to say, but it is the long-term approach and is shown over time to change behaviour. Probably the best example is that of defensive driving courses. Those will be maintained in the present legislation. There will be the incentive of decreasing that period of restricted driving for those who undertake a defensive driving course. And my understanding is that at the moment, those on learner licences are not able to participate in defensive driving courses, but this piece of legislation will allow that to be a viable option. And of course it should be. There is no wrong time to educate our young people about driving, about alcohol consumption and the like. And the third thing is that we mustn't allow this piece of legislation to let us take our foot off the accelerator on the engineering or fixing up our roads. And I'm pleased to say that that is happening. I had a holiday in the South Island at the end of last year and I was amazed. It's an area that I'm well used to. I was amazed at how much better the roads are now than they were even about 5 years ago. So that is continuing, but we must make sure that engineering and safe roads continues unabated. The ACT Party, Mr Speaker, will support this bill to Select Committee. We'll support it to allow the Select Committee to study the various provisions in the bill, investigate what has worked, what works well overseas and that we could adopt here, and to come up with a final bill which will adequately address the serious problems New Zealand has with road safety, without unnecessarily and unfairly targeting those who are driving responsibly. It's very important, Mr Speaker, that we get the balance right, and we hope to make a contribution at Select Committee to achieve that. Thank you.